There's been a major political development in Canada this week, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stepping down as the leader of the Liberal Party and therefore making way for a new Prime Minister in Canada in the next few weeks. To discuss these developments and what it means for Canadian politics as well as for Canada-India relations, I have with me the distinguished James McGill Professor TV Paul, who's also authored the book The Unfinished Quest. Many thanks, Professor Paul, for speaking with NDTV. My first question is with regards to the Canadian politics itself. Are we now likely to still see early elections in Canada?
Looks like elections will be in the spring after the Liberal Party chooses its interim leader. My sense is March, April, May will see an election, or an active campaigning should start after March.
Professor Paul, could this possibly mean that we could see a reset of India-Canada ties?
It all depends whether the Conservatives would like to, well, they are assumed to win the elections, want to reset this relationship as, say, Stephen Harper did in the past. I would see some momentum in the diplomatic level, re-establishing a certain level of consular and high commission level relations. One big challenge would be the Conservatives are going to put a lid on immigration as well as students coming into Canada. All that could hurt India in many ways. But I think the Conservatives are better positioned than the Liberals to restart this relationship because they are less ideologically positioned in terms of freedom of expression, freedom to organize, and the support for the Khalistan movement among the Liberals, at least some of the Liberals, and the NDP will not be a big issue there. But despite that, I think the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau went to Parliament makes it not so easy for any successor leader to substantially alter the narrative, partly because the case is ongoing and more revelations could come out. And at that point, any ruling party will have to be careful. But I do see that the increased tensions could now relax a little bit. And there is general feeling that this has gone too far.
So, Professor Paul, would you say this was a one-man problem, the problem being created between India and Canada only because of Prime Minister Trudeau, or is this a larger issue related to the Liberal Party itself? How do you see this?
Oh, it's a long-lasting Liberal issue. It goes back to Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who in fact had a much worse record with respect to this subject. The part of the problem is liberalism as an ideology carries many strands. One of them is for self-determination of groups seeking independence from larger entities. And there's also a importance that given to freedom of expression, especially those groups that are powerful in a domestic context. So in Canada's domestic context, the Khalistan supporters have quite a bit of power, electoral power. Not all 6 are for Khalistan, but still a large number are, and they can play a big role. But more than that, it is the liberal idea that somehow these fundamental liberal principles are more important than pragmatic, practical ideas of geopolitics or even realpolitik. And here I would argue that I just recently published a book called The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi. I think it's not in the book specifically, but among all the Western countries, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, Canada is the least willing to give India the rising power status. And one may ask, why is that so? I think it has a lot to do with the liberal ideology. They look at India as a partially done democratic state. It's going in the wrong directions. It's not going to be liberal as we are. Therefore, until they become like us or somewhat like us, we will start pushing these liberal agenda. I think part of it is a lot of misperceptions, poor reading of Indian history, and a lack of understanding of the partition and how violent that was, and the whole problem with Khalistan that generated enormous violence in the subcontinent in India in the 80s. And there's a total lack of empathy for this Indian argument that India's priority is to unite the country, keep it as a united nation state. Canadians don't quite get it, or liberals don't quite get it, why India is so conscious of its security and borders. And so this self-determination idea, Wilsonian idea to some extent, is sort of in the liberal mindset. And when you don't have much knowledge of a country, it becomes dominant. And the other issue, I would say that the single issues tend to dominate Canadian-India relations. Earlier it was Khalistan, then the issue of nuclear proliferation. India tested first bomb in 1974 with the Canadian supplied uranium, and so that really continued for a while. Only after the U.S. India Accord came in 2005, Canada was able to go along, and it took another 5 years for a rapprochement under Stephen Harper. So the current dynamics is not boding well. Secondly, India itself has a rather low opinion of Canada for all the historic reasons. But the Indian establishment, the elite in particular in Delhi, believe that Canada is not an important country. I mean, to some extent it is important, but it's a secondary player trying to really play a bigger role, especially when it comes to relations with India. So at least the current establishment in Delhi looks at look at Canada as a spoiler, especially Mr. Trudeau going to the G20 meeting in Delhi last year when India was shining, the moment that Modi was working on, and coming up with this irritant topic. Obviously, Trudeau was also trying to placate his domestic audience. So Trudeau and Modi simply could not get along. It's hard to see the next generation, next leadership will have exactly the same problem, but I think they could definitely start thinking areas where cooperation is possible.
Professor Paul, Canada has been seen as a middle power country. Does it remain to be so, or do you see that in the current scenario, it hasn't exercised its power that effectively?
Absolutely. This is actually a very interesting dimension connected to what I said before. It is the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, other even New Zealand, the other Anglo-Saxon countries have recognized India's role as a swing power, both in terms of strategic, geopolitical, as well as economic dimensions. Canada is yet to do that. Although the document that it produced about the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy has quite a bit of references to India, quite a bit of that is very limited discussion with respect to China, how to balance China, etc. But none of that has been actualized. And that is a big problem because Canada is now almost 80% trade dependent on the United States, which actually is proving to be one of the biggest mistakes, especially someone like Trump comes with this big threatening idea of imposing tariffs and even making it part of the United States. And Canada needs India. Canada needs China. If you look at Canada's relations, Brazil, Canada's relations with all these BRICS countries is rather poor. And that has a lot to do with ideology and less pragmatism. One can say that has some value, normative position taking. But when such a powerful challenge comes to your existential core, you need other partners, others, to deflect that challenge. And here I think the liberals have a big problem. They claim they are pragmatics, but they are not all that pragmatic when it comes to these developing countries rising. They haven't yet figured out how to use the developing world, especially these major developing countries, and their economies. Why should Canada-India trade be so low? And there should be an effort to engage a lot more. And the people-to-people interactions are increasing. You have now flights to all Indian cities from major Indian, Canadian cities. All of them are full, by the way. I just took one from Delhi, and I must say that a lot of people are flying back and forth. And the students are coming in, something like 240,000 or so last year. Yet, this nation-to-nation, state-to-state relations remain very low. And that is partly due to misperceptions, misunderstanding, and inability to see the connection between geopolitics and economics. And I think until Canada feels India is an important partner, and vice versa, this relationship is going to stay at the low level.
Professor Paul, many thanks for speaking with NDTV.
Thank you for having me, and best wishes to your work.